Hello and welcome to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly, Director of Advanced Media Production at Cal State Long Beach. Today we're going to talk about insects. The question is, are insects merely just pests that are here to bug us and to cause problems? Or are insects actually providing a very important role in the greater scheme of things? Or is it possible that actually both scenarios are true at the same time? We'll find out. My guest today is Jeannette Vaught. Dr. Vaught is an agricultural historian, and she is also a lecturer at Cal State Los Angeles. Welcome, Jeannette, and thank you for joining us on Talking Points.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, as we begin this discussion about insects, it occurs to me that everybody who's over the age of 40 probably has a memory or an anecdote about summertime, particularly if it was in the eastern half of the country, in the Midwest or the South or the East Coast, driving down the road, and if it's a long drive, say 60 or 70 miles, by the end of that journey, the windshield was absolutely full of insects that had smashed against the windshield driving through the countryside. And we don't see that much today. You can drive 50 or 60 miles and only maybe get one or two splats on the windshield. So that actually brings up a host of questions about what that means for us from an environmental standpoint. Is it a good thing because we don't have as many pests as I mentioned in the open? Or is it something to be concerned about because of what that might mean for the rest of the environment? And are the insects, in this case, the canary in the coal mine?
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's there's a lot of data in the anecdotes, and I think it's definitely true that there are many accounts, both scientific as well as more personal accounts, of this kind of declining number of insects around us at the kind of ground level, right, the car level and the air level. There's been some very alarming studies, in particular one study out of Germany that created a lot of press that perhaps 75% of insect density has been lost just in the past decade, which is, I think, something everyone should be alarmed by, even if you're not a bug fan. And I know and talk to a lot of people who are not bug fans most of the time, actually, although I am a bug fan. But it's the kind of thing where we have to be very careful about the way we interpret the world around us, right? And thinking about pests versus thinking about ecology and thinking about the importance of the environment and humans' role. So when we say we're losing a lot of bugs, yes, we might be in some cases losing a lot of pests, but the consequences for that might also be very dire. There's, I think, one way of thinking about just the incredible amount of bugs that surround us. And there was a study that was done by the United States Department of Agriculture starting in 1925, back when flight was still this kind of newish thing, right? And they hired a bunch of pilots and they started to fly around catching bugs in the air. And over the course of 5 years, they caught a ton of bugs at different altitudes, kind of seeing what species were around, where they were migrating, who was up there, just cultivating a lot of data. And they found over the course of 5 years that basically from the air column, if you draw a square mile in Louisiana, and you think about a column of air rising up from that square mile from the ground level to 17,000 feet, that column of air would contain about an average of 25 million bugs on any given day at any given time of day.
That's a lot of bugs.
That's a lot of bugs.
Let me just ask you this question. So if we're losing those bugs, and it seems like we have a lot that we can afford to lose because there was such density, but if we lose that density, what happens? What's the ripple effect on the rest of the environment?
The ripple effect on the rest of the environment is that all the species that eat the bugs, of course, if we think about the food chain, are going to have to look for different food sources. Right now we think of bugs as agricultural pests, right? But what is going to become an agricultural pest when the bugs are no longer eating or being able to feed other kinds of wildlife? At the same time, bugs play a really crucial set of roles in the ways in which plants and wild areas, in nature preserves, in agricultural areas, how they reproduce, how they kind of keep our planet green. So if we start to lose bugs, even bugs we don't care about or bugs we don't like, the ripple effects can be really, really dire for the planet's ability to absorb carbon, to produce beautiful plants, the flowers that people like to keep around their homes, to have a yard, to have healthy trees, to have birds in the trees, and for the basic, food chain of wildlife as well as agriculture. So it would be, I think, very serious consequence to lose this many bugs, which is why so many scientists are throwing up a flag of warning.
Well, let's talk about mosquitoes specifically, because mosquitoes are universally disliked by everyone. And mosquitoes carry a lot of very dangerous kinds of viral problems, such as malaria and yellow fever and West Nile virus and so forth. So wouldn't this be a good thing if we lose some of those mosquitoes? And what are the scientists in the labs doing with mosquitoes now with CRISPR gene editing technology?
Yeah, so mosquitoes are the focus of some pretty cutting edge scientific research. So a recent estimate says that across the globe, particularly in developing countries and tropical countries, malaria infects 200 million people a year and kills just a lot of people, including primarily children. So malaria is the kind of disease that, yes, you do want to be able to do something about and control, and mosquitoes are the key vector of malarial transmission of that parasite, which infects people with malaria. So doing something about mosquitoes, for sure, I think is, a really worthwhile kind of project. And one of the key ways in the past that people have tried to do something about mosquitoes is to try and kill them. This day and age, with gene editing technology, you have scientists who are attempting, instead of killing mosquitoes, to be able to reprogram their DNA so that you can kind of turn on and off, even though that's an inexact analogy, but you can turn on and off the exact genetic codes that would allow the mosquito to transmit the malarial parasite. So in that sense, you could have mosquitoes in the world doing their mosquito thing, feeding birds, pollinating plants, going around and, mosquitoing, which is a valid thing to do. But they would not be infecting people with malaria and not be infecting other kinds of valuable animal life with malaria. So in that sense, you would make mosquitoes much, much less dangerous without the risks of removing mosquitoes entirely from an ecosystem. Now, one of the kind of remaining doubts about that process is, what do you do when you go and you change the genetic codes of an animal with CRISPR, and then you release it into the wild, and you're not able to control how that changes future generations, how that might affect mosquito evolution, what kind of bugs we're going to be looking at in 5 years, 10 years down the road after this has really fully kind of incorporated into the ecosystem that mosquitoes live in. And also, we're just not sure what it would look like to eliminate malaria, from a particular human population or part of the world. The effects of that, while of course disease and suffering-wise might be immediately very positive, you have to really keep in mind the longer, bigger picture of what it would look like to eliminate, first of all, maybe a species or not in the case of CRISPR, but then what those longer-term effects might be, and those are very hard to predict.
And so we have to be careful that we're not just playing with fire here in terms of trying to put out a fire, creating a bigger fire.
That's exactly right, and it's important to not only think anthropocentrically, right? To not only think about effects on humans and to not only think about human comfort or even human safety when we're dealing with changing an entire ecosystem.
Well, let's talk about other insects that are a little bit more friendly to us, such as the bees. Now, if you've been bitten by a bee recently, maybe you don't think they're so friendly, but other than that, we know that bees are actually pretty popular in culture. About the only two insects that are more popular than honeybees are ladybugs and, of course, butterflies. Everybody loves butterflies. But just on the bees for a moment, and we will be talking to a bee expert on another program.
Because I'm not one.
Right. But just in general, we know that honeybees create honey, and they're also involved in pollination. But they've also been affected by some of these problems that have occurred in our environment. And in fact, there was a phenomenon known as the bee colony collapse disorder that has happened recently. What's going on with bee colony collapse disorder? What caused it?
Oh, there's a multitude of factors. One of the key factors that people have been able to, I believe, identify is the use of very particular kinds of pesticides, especially in the kind of plants that people would go and buy in their gardens, right, at Lowe's or Home Depot or the nursery, and it was just really widespread. So not only were they suffering from wide-scale pesticide applications on agricultural lands, but also they would go to suburban neighborhoods, they'd go, to where people could interact and see with bees and be consuming these particular very dangerous pesticides. And taking it back to their hive, and over a large scale and period of time that really had a devastating effect on bee colonies. But I also would love to put a plug in, if we're speaking of pollination and stinging insects that have very good PR, the Wasp Appreciation Society over here.
By the way, there's a survey that they did. They survey everything, and they found out on a scale of -5 to +5,
Yes.
as the scale, bees were at +5,
Yes.
but the wasps were at negative.
I believe it. People really hate wasps. But you know, if you're going to start loving bees, you should probably also start to love your wasps, because they do a ton of really great pollinating work, and they also eat flies. So be careful with those wasps. And I think if we start to think about wasps and bees as a kind of united multi-species front of pollination, then ultimately everyone's gardens will benefit, as well as the animals themselves. And we'll have a more accurate picture of valuing the insects that are around us.
Well, let's talk about butterflies, since I mentioned that. Butterflies and moths, because they're really part of the same family. We don't like moths very much, and there has been a tradition in the past of trying to get rid of moths by using what are called mothballs, because moths can eat into fabric and cause problems in that way. You don't hear much about mothballs anymore. Maybe that's because moths are disappearing. But butterflies are also endangered. And we know about the monarch, which is the famous butterfly that comes from south of the border and comes up north. It is now threatened. What's happening with the monarch butterfly?
Well, the monarch butterfly in particular, we're thinking about the ways in which migration patterns have been disrupted, and as well as the application of wide-scale pesticides. So when I was talking about the study that I brought up first, about that kind of 1925 air study, right, of how many migrating animals and insects there are at any given moment on any given day, a lot of those patterns have been disrupted by flight. They've been disrupted by climate change. They've been disrupted by the ways in which people tend their gardens, right? Monarch butterflies would congregate along roadside ditches that were sprayed with pesticides very heavily for many years. So the monarchs have had a kind of all-out, multi-pronged attack on them, just by the virtue of these kind of localized ways in which people kill bugs. And so that has created a much more challenging world for them to be living in, for sure.
Well, we need to go to the break at this point. And when we come back from the break, we'll talk about swarming insects, such as locusts. What are locusts, and why are they so aggressive? Stay tuned.
Make a difference in our future by researching and helping to preserve our natural resources. The wide variety of careers in this field will have a huge impact on our lives, while using the principles of engineering, chemistry, and biology to help find solutions to environmental problems. You could be a part of this exciting field with a degree from Cal State Long Beach.
Welcome back to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly. My guest today is Dr. Jeannette Vaught, and we're talking about insects. Jeannette, before we went to the break, I said we would come back and talk about locusts and locust swarms. Okay, and this used to be a really big problem in the United States in the 19th century. The locusts would swarm the prairie land and devour the corn crop or the wheat crop or whatever happened to be in its way. And there are even stories of locusts eating the shirts, literally eating the shirts off of people's backs, eating leather, eating wood, eating all kinds of things that got in their way. So let's talk about that for a moment. First of all, what is a locust, and where do locusts come from, and why do they swarm, and why are their swarms so aggressive?
Okay, that's a lot.
That's a lot of questions.
We'll start first. A locust is a species basically of grasshopper. So grasshoppers and locusts are in the same family in the Linnaean taxonomy, and there's a couple species of grasshoppers, about 20, that are capable of becoming locust through a process of phase change. So phase change basically is when the grasshopper, which is a species that could become a locust, hatches. If they were going about their normal solitarious phase life, then they would hatch and they would disperse, and they don't really like to be around each other. They'd hang out in the grass, they'd live their locust life, they'd mate if they need to mate. Otherwise, they would just kind of chill, right? And then go through the reproductive cycle until their life cycle ends. Now, it does happen that if locusts who, before they get to their gregarious swarming phase, right, If they become too close together, say they're struggling with enough food resources, or there's been a flood, or any number of factors that would cause them to be too close together than they really like to be, then there's a kind of endocrine change in their body that makes them larger and darker and more aggressive, and turns them into a different phase, the gregarious phase that their species is capable of. And in this gregarious phase is when you see the big swarms. And ultimately what a swarm is when enough gregarious phased locusts, which of course once they start to become gregarious, then all the locusts become gregarious. This endocrinal change really kind of spreads throughout a population. And then they begin to get very hungry and very aggressive, and they will start to eat everything around them in very rapacious kind of fashion. And so once they kind of get through all those resources, then they start to travel to new ones, and that's when you see the huge locust swarms start to form. So I think that answers all your questions about that. But I could talk for longer, but I think you probably need me to stop.
The aggressiveness is what always catches people by surprise, that they will just devour anything and mow everything down in their pathway. What causes such aggressiveness?
Well, it's difficult to determine in human emotions what causes such aggressiveness, but if you're making an analogy, I think kind of a rage eat is kind of where they're at, right? And so locusts and grasshoppers typically do not like to be close together. And when they're in a gregarious or swarming phase, they will eat anything in their path, including themselves. So they're cannibalistic. They will just go through and be focused on traveling and consuming until the gregarious phase is past. And so, yes, they will eat the shirts off people's backs. If you're unlucky enough to be out there, they'll eat the manes off horses. They will eat any living, fibrous thing, fence posts, right? The grease off of tractors, anything that they can get their little hard jaws on. And it's quite terrifying, quite terrifying.
Right. Well, let's talk about one particular type of locust, and I'm not a scientist here, so people will have to forgive me when I pronounce this, but the genus species is Monopolis spridus.
The Rocky Mountain locust.
The Rocky Mountain locust. And we call them the Rocky Mountain locust because they originated high in the Rocky Mountains, and then once they were ready to hatch and move on, they came east. I guess they had the jet stream behind them, so they would flow along through the Midwest, cause tremendous damage in places like Nebraska and Minnesota, devouring crops. In fact, Laura Ingalls Wilder, the famous author that wrote Little House on the Prairie, she also wrote another book, and I've got the list of books here.
On the banks of Plum Creek.
On the banks of Plum Creek, exactly right, where she talks about the locusts coming in and devouring the Minnesota wheat crops in 1874 and 1875.
Absolutely.
And but fortunately, that critter is essentially extinct now. What happened to make that particular locust, or actually, when we talk about the genus species, I gave the name of the Monopolis spridus. That actually means despised grasshopper, I guess.
It does.
What caused the despised grasshoppers to go out of business?
Oh boy. Okay, well, there's a lot to kind of unpack there. One thing I do want to say is that I don't think extinction is ever fortunate. So it's a kind of tricky one, right? Because it did cause a lot of destruction to settler colonists moving across the Midwest. But the Rocky Mountain locust, before it was called that, is an ancient species indigenous to this area of the world, the North American continent. And for many millennia, it was a very important food source, and it was actually the most populous animal on the North American continent, even more than bison were, before the area was colonized by white settlers. And so for many, many millennia, it was a very useful and important component of that grassland ecosystem. So I don't want to completely deride the locust here. But when settlers moved across the country, it did become difficult to establish agriculture because of their natural swarming cycles. Because if you are trying to have a farm, right, then if the locust comes and eats all your crop and eats the shirt off your back and terrifies the heck out of your family, then you're probably going to despise it, hence that, Linnaean taxonomy. So ultimately, there's a expert on the Rocky Mountain locust from Wyoming who's a real entomologist, a real scientist, and his kind of hypothesis for what happened to the Rocky Mountain locust after it went, or during its extinction, was the speed and scale at which that part of the world was able to transform into an agricultural landscape. So if we think about the years between 1870 and 1900, the same number of acres were transformed into agriculture during those 30 years as the 250 previous years. So in that period of time, you have the kind of diversion of water for irrigation. You have the tilling of grasslands that had held the soil for hundreds and hundreds of years in a kind of arid climate in the Midwest, in particular. Minnesota is where on the banks of Plum Creek is set. You have the transposition of different kinds of crops, and you also have the kind of phenomenon of plow and cow, right? You have grazing. You just have this incredible death by thousand, very rapid cuts to the locust, which devastated their breeding areas. It devastated their ability to cycle back around in their kind of swarm cycle through the Rocky Mountain jet stream. It gave them an incredible amount of food all at once, right, with these kind of agricultural crops, which then created a situation where they swarmed every year instead of every couple of years, and that really also was very taxing on their ability to continue as a species. So by 1900, they were gone, and they're the only species of locust that we know of at this period of time. I'm sure an entomologist might correct me if I'm wrong, that has gone extinct. It's actually very hard to eradicate many insects and locusts in particular. But the speed and scale of agriculture that the settler colonists brought with them across what became the United States was untenable for that particular species.
And just to put some perspective on this, it was estimated that one particular swarm back in about 1875, I think it was.
Albert swarm.
That's what it was called. And about 100,000 square miles
Yes.
it covered. And
Yes.
the estimate I saw was something like 12.5 trillion insects involved
Yes.
in that swarm.
Yes.
We can't imagine that today.
Right.
However, there are parts of the world that could potentially have that kind of swarm in Africa, for example.
Africa and the Middle East, and they get swarms quite a lot. And Australia as well still suffers from agricultural locust swarms. So the UN still has a very active anti-locust program, and it's focused primarily in regions of Africa that they're trying to develop into agricultural regions, and for a number of factors, including politics and violence and colonialism and all of these things, as well as insects. It's difficult to establish intensified agriculture, but locusts are a focus of a lot of research.
And it does seem that dry conditions, dry weather, seems to facilitate these swarms.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, let's talk about the difference between a locust and a cicada, because I think a lot of people get the two confused.
They do. They are different.
What is a cicada?
Cicadas are from different family. So if we look at the kind of like kingdom Animalia, and then you have over here the Insecta, right? And then under Insecta, you have different families. And so the family that has grasshoppers and locusts is over on this side, and they are hopping, ground-based, very quiet insects generally, right? And then you have another family that includes the cicadas. There's 3,000 species of cicadas. And the ones that I think North Americans are most familiar with are the ones that have a very long life cycle, right? They're called the 17-year cicada. And their life cycle is 17 years between the time that they hatch and become adults and then go back into a kind of fallow period. And one big difference that you guys can try and remember between cicadas and grasshoppers and locusts, cicadas are named for their song. They're very loud. They live in trees, right? They're going to be kind of above you, above ground level, and just be loud, loud, loud. Grasshoppers and locusts, unless they're swarming, are on the ground in in the grasses. Grasshoppers are named for where they want to be, which is on the ground, and they're pretty quiet, right? Unlike their cricket cousins. So grasshoppers and cicadas, very different.
I was trying to think of a romantic view of cicadas as song insects. Doesn't sound as good as songbird, but I guess.
It sounds great to them.
Okay, well, let's talk about the Midwest and the parts of the prairie that also experienced the Dust Bowl because of the same dry conditions that facilitated the swarms of locusts.
Absolutely.
They were more or less done with the locusts by the 1930s, but then the Dust Bowl. We've had dry conditions. In fact, we're going through some pretty dry conditions right now in the United States. Why don't we have a Dust Bowl now? Why did they have it then?
That's a really complicated question. One of the key factors that went into the Dust Bowl was the destruction of the grasslands, which held the arid soil and held moisture in the arid soil. And so settlers would come across the Appalachian Ranges, and they saw these incredible grasslands, and they saw the number of bison that were able to survive on these grasslands, and a huge number of species that we could not even conceive of now. And they made the mistake of thinking that that meant it was arable land for agriculture, which it was not. It was an arid kind of grassy desert, right? And so there was this belief among settler colonists, many of them, that rain would follow the plow. And so they believed that God would kind of bless their farming by bringing more rain after they tilled and planted agricultural crops. And so that pattern, of course, is not how climate works. It's not really how agriculture works, but this was the model that they were operating under. And so the destruction of root systems, as well as the planting of really thirsty crops that they were used to planting in Europe, say, or on the eastern seaboard with dark, loamy soil, just didn't work. And again, I would bring you back to the just intensification of the scale of how much land was being turned into agricultural land. So if you combine all of those factors together, the time that there could be a normal drought, that some grasses would be very dry, but the moisture would stay in the soil, it wouldn't happen that way anymore without the grass to do that. So the soil lifted, right? It gets very sandy, and it just lifted into what we view now as the kind of the Dust Bowl.
Now we're almost running out of time, but I want to give you a chance to talk about another issue involving insects, and that's the use of insects as a food source, because they're a high protein source of food. And so the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization is pushing for more use of insects in the human food supply. And again, we're very limited on time, so perhaps you could tell us what kind of form that would take if we start relying more on insects, and will we have to go into an agricultural industrial mode to create enough insects to feed the human population?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer to your second question is absolutely. So I think the dream of many people who want to include more insects into the human food supply would be to kind of revolutionize agriculture so it could be more environmentally friendly, and in some cases more friendly to the animals who are being farmed, such as cattle or hogs or chickens. And I think we just need to be very careful with those dreams, to consider the ways in which inviting insects into the agricultural process is not necessarily revolutionizing the agricultural process, because you are still going to be having to produce vast numbers of animals in very kind of efficient and strategic conditions, which is what we're doing now. So in order to, say, replace certain kinds of protein, or to kind of bring down some of the negative environmental effects that agricultural development has had over the past 50 and 60 years in particular, to incorporate insects, we're going to have to be very careful. It's not necessarily just a magic bullet for solving agricultural problems or adding more efficient protein into a human diet.
All right, and so we're not talking about necessarily hamburger patties versus cricket patties.
Right.
It's not going to take that form, at least not initially for a while.
Right, right. I mean, you think about patties as a kind of great innovation that came about as a result of more efficient meat production. It wasn't, something that existed before then. So the kinds of insect food products that humans will be eating will be a different form, I think, Right now, the most efficient way to produce a lot of protein is through powder, flours, to use cricket flour as opposed to other kinds of flours or grain flours. So I think that's going to be the first direction people come across.
And I think we've run out of time. I'm sorry to say that, because this has been a very interesting conversation, but thank you for being with us and sharing this important information.
Thank you so much. It's been so great.
And thank you for joining us on this edition of Talking Points. Join us again soon for another episode. Until then, I'm Dave Kelly. Have a nice day.